All right. Well, good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Very happy to welcome everyone to the wrap event for the Zionsville Town Code Charrette, which we've been working on all week. It's nice to see some familiar faces here tonight, people we've been working with, examining issues. Tonight, our hope is to, we're going to cover a little bit of the background. We've abridged some of that information. I think some of it is important to present this evening, and I'd like to welcome anyone participating or viewing this evening via stream. Happy to be providing that option thanks to the town's administration. So we are going to cover a little bit of information that you've heard before, but we are also going to spend some time synthesizing the discussions we've had over the week with residents, the town's administration, and business owners. So my name is Paul Lippens. I'm with McKenna. McKenna is a planning and design firm focusing in Midwest urban form, and we pride ourselves on being the kind of firm that focuses on the details. In addition to writing codes, we implement codes, and we work with residents and business owners to improve their properties and understand how codes relate to creating places, how codes are really essential to forming quality places, and in forming quality places through a good code, how in staying true to that code, we can create the place and the community that we want to live in. I'd like to ask my team to come up and introduce themselves as well. So I've got Danielle here.
Hi, my name is Danielle Bouchard. I'm a senior planner with McKenna. I will be serving as a project planner on this project for all various aspects of the ordinance. Most notably, I work on a lot of mapping and GIS items with the project. So all these maps around the room, that's the product, minus that one, the product of my work. So thank you guys for coming.
Mike here.
My name is Michael Campbell. I'm the architect on the team. This week, my role has been to help you define a consensus vision for the rural areas of the township and to begin developing building types. And going forward, I'll be focused on those building types and other aspects of the form-based code.
And good evening, I'm Adam Cook. I'm a consulting planner with McKenna, and many of you have gotten to know me as I've been managing the public outreach and charrette process we've undertaken. And going forward, I'll be working very closely with the team on many different issues, ranging from urban design all the way to research and a number of things. So thank you.
All right, and I see Wayne is here from the town. Wayne's going to give a wave. Thank you, Wayne, for all your help this week. We appreciate it. I would say I'm excited to present this to everyone tonight, including some of the synthesis. You know, I think this will cover a lot of what we've done this week, but I do want to say we got so many amazing photographs, and given more time, we would be giving more of a slideshow about what we love about Zionsville. But we have been this week updating our website that we've created for this project called zionsvilletowncode.com. If anyone's interested in seeing some of those photos, I believe we have a gallery up now that shares some of those photos, and we'll update those galleries too. So we want to share our photos they capture our impressions and our experiences. And I think in looking at the photos we've taken, you'll see a bit of our journey this week too. So I'd hope to get a slideshow of just photos and impressions in tonight. And we didn't quite get there, but I'm very happy with what we did get done. So look forward to showing you some of that. So quickly, I'm going to do a briefer introduction and then turn it off to some of my team members so we can get to synthesis. But when we talk about reorganized coding, I think one of the important things about Zionsville is just understanding that the code that governs this community is really the remnants of several codes from Union, Worth, and Eagle, and Perry, and village that have been amalgamated as these areas were coming together under one jurisdiction. Our look is, what we're looking to do in this process is to look at all of those different districts, determine the similarities, the differences, understand the real purpose of those regulations, and then eliminate redundancies so we can create some clarity and create a code that is easier to understand and easier to use. And so we all that reorganized, and I think it correlates, as Adam will talk a little bit about what we think is the reorganized area of development for this community. So you'll hear us talk about things like coding standards, coding precedents, coding designs, conventional coding or conventional zoning, and form-based coding. The code that Zionsville has now, we would call that a conventional code. And, simply put, it's a code organized around establishing what types of activities or uses can happen in what very broad districts. We're moving more towards a design-based code or a form-based code, which is a code that will illustrate the types of designs, the forms, and the look, the style of the aspects of the community, how that physical form will be represented in various places. And there's lots of tools for doing that. But I think one thing to understand that is this idea that within a region, your form type and your place type changes. And this illustration on the bottom of this graphic shows that. This is called a transect. And generally it describes the progression of land development from the center or core of an area to the rural area. And I think what's interesting about this place, this community, is that you really have a lot of these places. And in thinking about how a community should develop, we have to think about how to protect the values associated in these places, because what we've learned is that whether you live in the rural area in Zionsville, the village, or anywhere in between, all of those types of places are valuable in how this community envisions itself. So if you live in the village, part of the reason you live there is because of that pristine rural character. And similarly, if you live in some of the rural areas of the town, you value the village, right? So this transect, the way the form develops in this area, is really important to what it means to live here. And I show this picture because this is where I grew up, in the village of Dixboro, which is outside of Ann Arbor. One of the things that Dixboro did in the early 1980s is they developed a growth management plan. And right when I became a planner, I started, let's say, the early aughts. That's a term that we like to use. I started thinking about, why I wanted to become a planner. A part of it, I think, is preserving the great parts of life, the things that I think I value. And I remember talking to the supervisor of my community, and he told me, this was when I was deciding if I wanted to be planner, but he said, in Superior Township, with Dixboro is part of a larger township. It's actually a hamlet, and we'll talk a little bit about that. He said, you've got Detroit and you've got Chicago, and eventually it's going to be one big city. And we just want that to jump over Superior Township so we can stay the same. And they started working very hard in the early 80s to do that. And growth management is not easy to do. It's an active process, and it involves commitment. And so those are kind of the values that I take to the profession. And I think in understanding that urbanism, right, what makes urbanism, we see these types of values in design values now, not personal values, but you see them in different places. So what makes a good city is also what makes a good general store. And those types of design values speak to each other wherever you are. So you want transparency, you want to see the retail, you want these places organized around the transportation system so that they relate to the types of ways people get around the community. But good design is good design is design, right? So punched openings, awnings, windows, these are the types of things we want to create in a form-based code. And we do that with illustrations. There's a reason why people say a picture's worth 1,000 words. And, you know, there's a reason why the Zionsville ordinance right now is 500 pages. So part of doing the form-based code and making it easier is actually eliminating some of those words and making the concepts a little easier to understand with graphics, with standard diagrams. So people can look at the code, understand what's required of them, and then do it. So, and part of coding districts is understanding the neighborhoods that they exist on, and also understanding that transportation system and the connections. And a lot of the adjustments we've been making this week are really formed on our understanding of those systems. You know, one of the big adjustments we made was understanding the progression of Ronald Reagan Parkway and how that would affect the future. So we've been learning about the transportation systems and the corridors and kind of adjusting the principles as we go. So what do form-based codes do? Form-based codes do regulate uses, but they also rely mostly on the form of those buildings, the structures. And in doing that, it also allows you to regulate uses by building story. So you can require retail on a first floor. You can permit office on the upper stories, or you can require residential on upper stories. Conventional codes can't accomplish that. You can't accomplish the regulation of use on stories of buildings in a conventional code. Also, rather than just create, for instance, setbacks that encourage a compliance or say you must be set back this far, but you could set back further. Form-based codes require can require a more standard approach with build to lines. So we can create or require a street frontage area by requiring different types of buildings to build to a certain build to line. And in form-based codes with a building type approach, we can actually regulate that by building type. So we can allow residents to be right next to, say, a mixed use building, and the residents can be at a 10-foot setback or something appropriate with other residences in that area. And the mixed use type building can be right at the lot line. And that actually works very well next to each other. In a conventional code, it's very hard to regulate a variated street front like we have in Zionsville. So form-based codes are very good at actually allowing that kind of natural progression of development themes that happened in cities over time to be a part of a new build or a retrofit project. Form-based codes also do contain architectural regulations, whether they're general regulations just about window placement or percent of transparency, or more specific regulations about building materials, durable materials, and structural regulations or ornamentation. One way or another, a form-based code will have architectural regulations. So again, I said they can regulate street types and connections. This is often something that you'll see more for a new build area, which we are talking about potentially some regulations for new development areas or new mixed use development areas as part of this as well. And I think one of the things we've talked about a little bit is if you can get a consensus on vision, form-based code can help you to streamline the development process. And this is something that I think has come out over the week, right? I think that there's been a lot of effort in this community to make sure that new development does match the preferences of residents in this community. But sometimes that's a fight because it's the code doesn't necessarily express what the preferences of the community are. My hope is that with a form-based code, the community can view themselves as a pro-development community, but you're pro-development when development complies with the code. If it doesn't, you shouldn't have to fight. It should be denied. And that's the value of having a code that you have consensus around. And in this last bullet, it says exactly what I just said. So you require development to fit a predetermined concept. And that's how you get a streamlined development process. So here's where we are in the project. Before we started this week, we had done some analysis. We'd worked to understand the conditions in the code but we didn't understand the people and the preferences. And you really can't make recommendations until you spend time understanding what those preferences are. And that's why we did the charrette. So we've been here a week talking to people. We say we embed ourselves in the community, and only through doing that can we feel confident that we can make recommendations that we think do address the issues that we've heard. And we hope in having so many conversations that we do learn what the issues that people care about are. And I think we've done a fairly good job. I think we really exposed some things we didn't think we would be talking about, and we made some progress. So we're happy to present a little bit about that tonight. But I will say, if you look at this chart here, we are at the beginning of the process. We still have to take what we've heard and actually work that into a draft code. Then we have to seek technical feedback to see if the language we've crafted does what we think it will do. And then we have to issue a draft that is ready for the public to put through that same level of scrutiny. And only after that would we propose that the town consider a code for adoption. This whole process, we think, will probably take another 9 months to a year. It's not a quick process to write a code, but it is a valuable process. Sometimes people ask me about policy development, and I'll say, well, I can write you a policy in an afternoon. But if I do that, you'll never pass it and it'll never have any effect. What we really need to do is understand what the policy should do, and then work with the people who will be implementing that policy to make sure that they want to implement it or want the policy to come into effect. That's policy development, and that's what we're trying to do well through this process, is create a code that really does reflect the values of the people who will be affected by it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam. And Adam, I skipped right over your charrette discussion tonight, and I didn't get to know the audience, so maybe you can help us with that.
Thank you, Paul. Brief show of hands time. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces tonight, which is wonderful. But if you have attended any of the previous evening events this week, let's do a quick show of hands there. Oh my goodness. That's incredible. So nearly all of you, not all of you, but nearly all of you have attended at least one event this week. And we can't tell you how grateful we are and how much we appreciate that, because we are asking a lot of your time. Second question, actually that answers most of my questions. I'll save you the trouble. It also means that I'm not going to belabor some of the points that I've made in my previous presentations, but I do want to cover everything a little bit for those that haven't seen us before. And the first thing I want to cover is, what is a charrette? And very briefly, I'm not going to tell my long story, but very briefly, what we have been accomplishing this week is a very intense, compressed process where, as Paul said, we are embedded in the community. We're getting to know you personally, and we're also doing a lot of work and a lot of synthesis of everything we found out. And the point of the charrette model is really about pushing yourself and working until the very last minute, which is why I think we got here at 6:59. And that's okay, that's by design, because literally as I was driving the car, not an exaggeration, Paul is there finalizing our slide presentation for you. But that's because, again, we've been so successful and we've heard so many different voices, and we want to make sure that we're doing the best job for you that we can. And that said, these food for thought slides, many of you have seen most of these, so I'm going to do an abridged version just to drive the point home that, you know, if we're going to, as a community, create such a important document that'll define the future of our built environment, we absolutely have to do that based on a foundation, you know, a solid foundation of knowing where we've been. And of the many communities that we've worked in, both individually and also as a team, there are few like Zionsville that really has such a deep connection with its history, which has really helped us lay the groundwork for a lot of these discussions. So very briefly, if we go back, many of you have seen this map at this point, but 1878, we look at, oh, laser pointer doesn't work on these screens. Well, 1878, if we look at Boone County, we look at the general pattern of development at that time. You see Zionsville there in the lower right-hand corner. You see the railroad as really being the major line of communication or transportation between Zionsville, Lebanon, and then of course Indianapolis. But what you also see is a landscape, a county landscape dotted with small to medium-sized towns as well as hamlets, and the rest of course being active agriculture. And so when I talk about hamlets, I'm talking about places that maybe don't have so much of a definition today in 2021, but places that many of you have personally told me you remember from previous years or heard about from previous generations. So if you look towards the top right corner of that map, you'll see Northfield, you'll see Roston, you'll see a place called Ratsburg, which is over a little bit closer to Lebanon. And then of course, down by the label there in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see Fayette. And so some of those names are, like I said, familiar and in active use, and some have fallen out of use. But that's generally the development pattern that has gone back all the way to sort of the beginning of sort of the modern era of settlement in this region. Other point to drive home, when we talk about regulating land use, even though zoning and form-based coding are sort of modern tools to regulate land use, the idea of doing that has been in our communities for a very long time. So as far as the village is concerned, the village of Zionsville's first land use ordinance was all the way back in 1881, and that abolished slaughtering animals on any property in the village. You can also see another one from 1923 that, again, these issues were originally addressed kind of on a case-by-case basis. And in the 1920s, we had this new technology called the motor car. And motor cars, of course, needed oil filling stations. And so the first permit for that was issued back in 1923. And you can also see that zoning came to the village as early as 1941. And in subsequent decades, typically in rural counties and their townships in states like Indiana and Ohio and Michigan, many of those jurisdictions also got zoning a little bit later into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as a matter of fact, even today, there are some rural jurisdictions that do not have zoning, but not very many. Most jurisdictions have adopted some form of zoning as their tool for regulating land use. The point I want to drive home on this slide is this is a plat of Zionsville, also from 1878. Look at the different colors on that map. And the different colors refer to different eras of sort of street construction or platting. So that yellow square there says, if you can see it, says original plat on it in the lower right-hand corner. That was the original town as platted by Mr. Zion and his partners when the railroad came through. And as the town grew, other speculators, other developers, the term we would use today, made additions to that town. So you can see them in pink. And if you take a close look at this map, and this is available online or over at Sullivan Muntz as well, they've got a very nice framed copy of this. And you can see all the details, but you can see Oliver's edition. You can see Cross, he did several different editions, so on and so forth. But the commonality there between all of those different colored squares is that those that came after Mr. Zion kind of followed generally the same pattern. Doesn't look exactly identical, but in terms of the size of lots, the size of streets, so what we call the block structure. There was a pattern that was developed originally and that was generally replicated as the town expanded. And you can see that that pattern was followed all the way up through really the pre-World War II era. And Wayne was nice enough to bring down that beautiful blueprint over there. And I encourage you to take a look at that. That's actually from 1923. And so you can see that there have been some additions to the town even beyond what we're looking at here that again followed that same basic pattern. One of the interesting things that happened was when you've got the yellow down there and you see a green square above it. When Cross made his first edition, they made a little goof up. They didn't survey things exactly correctly and the streets did not line up. Because the streets did not line up, you ended up with a jog in Main Street as the town grew north. A jog like that is something that makes Main Street kind of a postcard image. You know, that's what we call the postcard view. That's the signature view of the village. And that's something that planners didn't plan. There was no genius you know, William Zion or anybody else, any of the early founders or settlers in the region, nobody had this brilliant idea. Yeah, let's make the street crooked. You know, that'll be great. It'll work really great for tourism in 2021. They weren't thinking that. Okay, these are happy accidents, as the painter Bob Ross said. These types of things you can't plan for. But at the same time, they're things that end up becoming ingrained, those little irregularities that actually do work very well. So when we talk about urban design and thinking about things kind of at that small block scale, we have to think of these sort of large scale patterns that have developed over generations, but we also want to be sensitive to those little irregularities. Maybe you could call them quirks that really make places unique and lovable. And in the interest of time, I am going to go quickly through some of this material. What we see here is that Zionsville and of course Boone County has really been at the forefront of many of the transportation technologies of the eras. So from passenger rail to interurban, of course, all the way to the automobile and the interstate highway system. In each of those eras, that main form of transportation had a direct impact on land use patterns, both in the village and in the areas that now are part of the modern town of Zionsville. And when we get to the 1950s, of course, you can actually see what the village looked like there in 1956. If I go over here, we can look at some aerial photos and we can look at land use patterns. So in 1955, remember President Eisenhower passed the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, and within about 5 or 6 years, we had construction of Interstates 465 and 65 and 74 coming into central Indiana. But this was kind of right on the precipice of that. And in 1955, we can still see that the village of Zionsville, that village plat really was the nucleus of the region. And radiating out to the north and to the west, what we see is predominantly open agricultural land. Now, okay. Thank you, Paul.
You skipped the end.
I apparently skipped to the end.
You pressed.
I skipped too far. Being too respectful of your time. No, please stick around. We do actually have more stuff. What you're going to see, thank you. Yep, about where I was. What you're going to see is if we forward 25 years. Okay, so here's 1955, here's 1981, and we see a new pattern forming, right? This is the single-use residential subdivision. You see these little street networks that look very different from Zionsville's grid appearing throughout portions of Eagle Township, Worth Township, and into Union Township. The other pattern that we see emerging in those years in the 50s, 60s, 70s is some lot splitting. So the larger agricultural parcels are getting split into smaller, still relatively large lot residential parcels. And if we go again another 15 years, so 81 and 2005, what you'll see there is basically an acceleration of that very trend. Okay, so we've got an expansion of those single-use residential neighborhoods. We also have a new, down in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the beginnings of Stonegate, which is a different type of community. That's what we would call a T&D, or a traditional neighborhood development. So if you've never actually driven back into Stonegate, I'd encourage you to do that just to see sort of the differences between some of the other newer neighborhoods that have come to the area in the last 20 or so years. There's actually a main street in there and a village green and a school that fronts on that village green, as well as some very nice traditional town architecture. But that is self-contained in that development. Of course, you'll also see that the pattern of lot splits and lessening of some of the active agriculture as we get closer into the village, closer in through especially Eagle Township has continued. And then of course, this is 2020. And now we can see not only Stonegate having been completed, but if you look in that far lower left corner, you'll see the beginnings of what is now turned into Main Street over in Whitestown, which of course is out of Zionsville zoning jurisdiction, but has had a major impact on the regional pattern of development. And so in this era, we call this the reorganization era, 2000 to present. And I think we're going to elaborate on this a little bit later, because this really feeds into what we have heard from so many of you throughout the week. What are some of the things that we're seeing now? We're seeing in the village questions about the types of residential structures that are being removed, the types of residential structures and some of their characteristics that are going up in their place. We're seeing also some very nice rehabs. And this is an example from 2007 and 2019 that we just pulled off of Google Street View. We've since gone and seen the house in person. And several others. This one, as a matter of fact, I later learned wasn't a tear down of choice, but it's still an example of that changing village fabric. And that's okay. Communities do change over time. You know, villages, Zionsville, when we think about the village itself, this is a very active place. This is a working community. This is not Disneyland Main Street. That's what makes people love it, and that's what makes it so authentic. And I think those are qualities that we've heard again and again expressed, that we don't want to lose. We don't want to lose that. We don't want to make it necessarily too perfect, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not losing too much, okay, of what we like about it. We'll talk a little bit more about hamlets. This, of course, is Fayette, which is a great example of one of the hamlets that's kind of hung together a little bit better than others in the region. One of the things we've been talking about is urban-rural. So currently in your existing zoning ordinance, right, there are rural districts and there are urban districts. And those were really, that's a compromise measure because you had multiple codes that were just basically sandwiched together between two covers as a result of the consolidation, the cooperation agreement, you know, from 2010. But we still have to think about that rural-urban boundary. There are other implications for it, right? There are utility implications, tax implications. But from a zoning perspective, when we think of urban and rural, we have to think about you know, the distinction between those land uses, and not just reorganizing and simplifying those zoning districts, but actually thinking about them really in a more philosophical perspective about how we want to see certain areas, open spaces, agricultural lands preserved, and where we want to see development, because this is a dynamic region, an exciting region. But there are development pressures. There are development pressures from the east, from Westfield, from Carmel, from the south, from Brownsburg, and all of these things have to be taken into account. I mentioned I always mention Stonegate at the wrong time before I get to the photos. And one reason we show that for sale sign there on the Carolina Grill, that just has to do with Stonegate's Main Street being placed right in the middle of the development. When you do that, and that was a maneuver many developers of T&Ds did about 25 years ago before they realized you actually have to put the retail on a major street that borders it, because you do need to have more eyes on that development than just those that live in the neighborhood. When I talk about Carmel and Westfield there, you can see some of the directions that they've gone with their development. And so simply to wrap up, we think about the coming era. This is a great picture to summarize that. You know, it's really in your hands. You've been handed this wonderful place. Many of you by generations, many of you are, you know, descendants from a long line of generations that have taken this place and made it what it is. And here at this present moment in time, it's really time for us to step up and make those decisions that are going to impact next 2, 3, even 4 generations. And so rather than get nervous or, you know, let this go in one ear and out the other, I think this is a time to really galvanize and get excited and see the opportunity for what it is. And I know we certainly do, and I know that we're blessed to be working with you, as we found out this week. So I'm going to introduce Mike Campbell to talk a little bit more on the rural character issue here.
Yes, thanks, Adam. That's been my role this week, is to help the stakeholders develop a vision for the rural areas of the city, which are actually the townships of Perry and Union and Eagle. And Worth. Is that still out there? Oh, okay. I thought that Worth was a historic township. So in terms of pattern of growth, how these areas have developed, and Adam mentioned, he showed you 1981. By 1981, a pattern of development, new pattern of development had already been established, which is large lot single family houses filling out entire sites, as shown here. So if you have a 40-acre site and you've got development rights for 1 unit per 40 acres, you would get 40 lots, and that would be the end of the story. And that's continued, he showed 2005 and 2020, so it's continued to this day, and there's plans for more of it. And then it's what happens is it's followed by this, and because services traditionally follow residential development, and then the area is no longer rural. It begins as farmland, and then it turns into this. Okay. Now, what we've been proposing all week, and we've learned there's a lot of support for it, is instead a vision for new hamlets set within an existing rural landscape. And hamlets, you've probably seen them, examples of them around the area: Roston, Gadsden, and Fayette. They were essentially no different than any other town. They in the way they started, but they just never took off and never grew like what way some of the other towns did. And there's examples we have in Michigan. Almost always have a corner store and a collection of somewhere between about 7 and 20 houses, somewhere in that neighborhood. There's a couple of them in Michigan that have restaurants, which is really nice. One of them it's the oldest restaurant in the state. But we're going to co-opt this, or we're proposing to co-opt the term hamlet for something slightly different. We want to, which is a way of clustering the 40 units that I was talking about. If somebody had a 40-acre parcel and they get development rights for 1 unit per acre, they'd wind up with 40 lots. So we want to use the hamlet concept as a way of clustering those units into one area of the site, and then preserving the remaining land to remain active in agriculture or for recreational uses. I guess I can't use the pointer on that kind of screen. So that's shown here, and with the right architectural standards, this will look a lot like hamlet. The retail will be small. We would probably envision once again just a general store. And actually, this diagram, which I haven't mentioned earlier this week, shows the civic building as well as an example. It has a little church in there, and a church would be nice as well. The development, as it stands now, the agricultural parcels in Zionsville, with the reincorporation or consolidation of the jurisdictions, is resolved to 1 unit per 2 acres. So if we employ this hamlet concept in Zionsville, you preserve even more open space than the example previously shown. And what would, actually something we've learned this week, what would preserve even more open space than that is what preceded in many areas of the township, those that were controlled by Boone County, is 1 unit per 7 acres. And we could do an even better job if we were to return to that. And we wouldn't need very many hamlets at all then, or if any. That would be it's really the purpose of this is to preserve agricultural land and preserve the rural character. And you have some existing hamlets already, so the addition is not necessary to preserve the rural character. Oh yes, somebody has that. I don't know. They call them development rights a lot of times. I don't know if that's a technically valid term, but people refer to them as development rights. If you're allowed 1 unit per acre, so something that's conveyed through zoning, by the way. We're capped by clustering the lots. We're capturing all of those units, all of those buildable units that you would have had under the conventional model, and then re-employing them, I guess, in another format. So the other thing we want to propose is walkable mixed-use developments or towns. So the town would be sort of emulate the hamlets that actually grew into towns, and they can accommodate a lot more in the way of development, including multifamily structures, missing middle housing, and additional retail and commercial and civic uses. they could function like satellites of Zionsville. There's a lot of growth in downtown, a lot of growth in traffic in downtown Zionsville right now. The village itself may be kind of maxed out in terms of its ability to service the population. You know, so we're proposing, you could think of as satellites of the village. A good example of that is in Stuttgart, Germany. You can see the map here. It shows 9 suburbs west of Stuttgart, Germany. The black box indicates the size of one U.S. township. So you can see those 9 suburbs are contained within one U.S. township, which is 36 square miles. And still, they have been able to preserve, you know, most of the area as agriculture or forest land. And we refer to this as rural character. Oh, they also have a lot of hamlets. I don't have the pointer. I could point to the little hamlets in addition to the 9 towns. So real character, we call this rural character because rural areas are made up of small towns set in a serene rural landscape with numerous hamlets. This is an American town, Crested Butte, Colorado. We like to show it because you can see the town and the rural landscape in one image. And also because the 2 buildings in the middle were developed according to a form-based code that was adopted probably in 1980 or 81, but developed in the late 70s. Let's see. Okay, in order to achieve this pattern of development, we need to first identify locations for Newtown development, and we've made some attempts to do that. We came in here tonight with you know, a preliminary notion of that. And we've learned a lot about the concept, and we have actually made some modifications. But these development locations should be based on highways and interchanges, existing rooftops and existing rail lines. Because, you know, if you think about this idea of developing new town centers, there's going to be one component of that is going to be retail. And what we've learned, and we're good at this in Michigan, but what we've learned is that these retail centers need to have a lot of traffic going by and a lot of visibility in order to be viable. So what we envision for these towns is, you know, an actually working, functioning town, a real place. And so we want that retail to thrive. And so therefore we look for locations that are high traffic locations, but yet developed. So here's this slide indicates some of the first of all, it indicates the 4 locations that we initially selected for hamlets. The first one, number 1 on the lower left-hand corner, which is near Fayette. Second one is a small parcel in Eagle Township that fronts on Whitestown Parkway, where all that development is. And the third one, up C300 East, I think is what it was called, and US 421. We subsequently learned was has already gone into development as a conventional retail center. So that's why you see the red X there. We're going to X that one out. The other 2 where the arrows are, we're going to move those. We've been encouraged to move the other 2, 1 and 4. And so this is the locations we're considering at this time. Number 4, we moved up to an existing hamlet, Roston. So we're not going to keep that as a hamlet. We're proposing that become one of the town centers. And haven't changed the diagram yet, but we're going to think about proposing that be developed down to Indiana 32, right below the number 4 there. Anyway, once the locations have been selected, stakeholders like you are called upon to identify precedents upon which the new developments are to be based. So before we write a code that guides the development of those town centers, we pick a precedent. We find a place like downtown Zionsville or Nashville, Indiana, and we go out and measure everything. You know, we measure the streets, the sidewalks, the building setbacks, the building heights, the window, the percentage of glass, the windows, the proportions of the windows, spacing of light fixtures, and all of those sorts of things, so that developments that follow the code will ultimately resemble those precedents that you select. this strategy will preserve rural character and manage growth. This is a slide for earlier. There'll be a lot of discussion tonight. So if you have anything to say on this topic, we look forward to working with you. And I think that we're going to turn this over to Danielle now. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'll briefly just go over some administrative procedures and standards that we've identified through the first portion of this process that started a couple months ago. As Paul alluded to earlier, we did start with our analysis or diagnostic of the current code, and then the charrette kind of followed that process. So through that process of the diagnostic, we've picked out certain areas that we think could use some enhancement or clarification, things like that. So for example, some highlights of those recommendations as they relate to administrative procedures and standards. Essentially, we want to pull out all the sections that relate to administrative procedures and standards and put them into one. So that way they're not located in various aspects or various areas of the code. So you can have everything that relates to site plan development, special exception review, and approval criteria, PUD processes, planning commission processes, BZA processes, amendments, violations enforcement, all in one area. Further, we would like to do a restructure of the non-conformity section, starting with a summary of non-conformity regulations or a table. Again, and you'll kind of hear this pop up a lot during our discussions and as this process moves forward, that we like to make sure that everything is easy, user-friendly, has a lot of graphics, tables, things like that. So for the section of the code in relation to development plans, this essentially, this table on the graphic is from a community that, or we pulled from a different community that we work with that essentially outlines the process for what type of improvement and then what you need to show on your plans in order to achieve that type of improvement, to either get administrative approval or plan commission approval, BZA approval, so forth. So again, this is kind of just an example of something that we've used and have worked with in other communities that we find to be pretty useful, and that developers or residents or staff people can look at this and easily understand what needs to be done. Further, we would like to restructure and condense the special exception uses, kind of further explain and clarify the processes for public hearings, any action by the BZA, post-approval procedures, expirations, site plans, and what's required on site plans, things like that. So all of that will be combined, and everything that relates to this area will be condensed and put into the same section of the code. So that way you don't have to pick through, 50 different pages and different parts of the ordinance to try to find what you need in relation to this. So another portion of what we did during our diagnostic analysis is a review of the variances that have occurred from 2020 to present. Which is kind of a discussion that's been coming up on and off again over the last couple of days, is how the town goes about the variance process. So there were 83 overall approved over the last year or so, 3 of which have been denied. For, of course, a couple relate to accessory structures, which are 13 approved, 1 denied, building height, setback, lot requirement, design standards, uses, use variance in structures, and so forth. An important part of updating a code is figuring out where are these holes coming from? Where are these variances that people are requesting from the code, and then how does that relate to the actual built environment? So there might be something that isn't really jiving with what existing conditions are in real life versus what the code says that you need to do. So we additionally will also take a look at a bunch of different aspects of the code, not just building design and form-based regulations. The the code in its entirety will be updating and taking a look at to make sure that it's not only in compliance with modernization, but also with state laws too that have changed over the last however many years. So we'll be taking a look at landscaping and screening, which is also of such a huge piece to our built environment and the way that things look and feel. Signs, environmental performance or sustainability, lighting, accessory structures and uses, fences, walls, buffers, you name it. We're going to be taking a deep dive into all of these things, that it's not just, centered on the village area and what those buildings may look like. And lastly, we will be taking a look at usability recommendations. Again, common theme here is that we're trying to condense, simplify, and make things clear and user-friendly. That which involves adding hyperlinks and cross-references, a bunch of graphics, tables, removing obsolete text or things that may not be applicable to today's world, updating those definitions to make sure that everything that is in the code is also defined in a easy to understand way. And then this just kind of shows a tentative idea of what that code organization could look like. So you've got your title, you've got your zoning districts and map, and one of the most important and probably most frequently used pieces of a code is the schedule of regulations. So that'll tell you, heights and setbacks and lot coverage for accessory structures and principal structures and all of that. So this is kind of just a general idea of that organization that we can kind of start pulling from to make everything user friendly and understandable. I think this is passing off.
Thank you, Danielle. So I'm going to briefly take over for our colleague, Chris Corey. And if you were around on Monday or Tuesday, you would have met Chris, and becomes immediately apparent what a zoning guru Chris is. And so I'm going to very briefly summarize some of the material that he worked on. So again, I think some of the goals of this process, right? Enhance existing conditions. We've got to understand the market. I think we touched on that a little bit, especially with Stonegate and some of the commercial aspects there. That's just one sort of case study about needing to understand the market. Obviously reflecting goals on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, on a more fine-grained basis. You want to do some of this? So the synthesis stuff? Yeah, Paul, why don't you do that?
We thought there was more, but I possibly cut more. So Adam just did 3 slides. That's okay. So what we've heard, all right. So this is our report back, right? This is the wrap up, right? So rural areas. I think that there is a desire to do growth management as I mentioned, but I think that there's some policy issues that need to be addressed for not just roads, other types of, your sewer, your water infrastructure. This is all a part of growth management. But I think one of the things I wanted to cover here is the idea of whether or not you build more public roads, more private roads, and how to have control. Your zoning ordinance is actually very effective at controlling private roads. So we want to look at private road standards and determine how and when private roads should be permitted to be built to service developments. I think that the hamlet concept that Mike is introducing, that would be a good case where in building a hamlet, we might permit private roads to be developed. But if someone were to propose development in the conventional 100 lot, 1 per acre or 1 per 2 acres, that might be an opportunity for us to say, in some districts maybe, but not in the ag district. And that's the value of looking at the road systems as part of this. I think additionally, we have to think about how the town and county or any jurisdiction is expending money building public roads. I think it's important to understand that as residents of an area, you may experience some delay as a region grows, right? The region gets bigger and there are more people traveling in the region. And obviously nobody likes delay. It could be very frustrating. But sitting at 30 seconds for a light or 10 seconds or waiting at a stop sign as some of your friends and neighbors go through that stop sign, as frustrating that is, I think we would encourage operational solutions, traffic timing of signals, thinking about how the system can be retrofitted for operation solutions rather than building new roads or expanding roads. I think a part of what makes the system from a land perspective work now and service the land uses is that it is a road system that's designed for the types of uses the community has. When you seek to relieve that pressure, to relieve that system and maybe relieve the pain of that delay, if it's a 30-second delay you're experiencing regularly, what happens is a phenomenon of triple convergence, which to my knowledge was maybe first described by this Vucic book called Transportation for Livable Cities, which was published first in 1999. This concept of triple convergence, at least that's where I learned of it. I'm going to describe it, right? So you have a road, and that road is maybe experiencing some delay for the residents that live there. And so the idea is let's expand it. Let's build an extra lane, or maybe let's build another road so we can go that way too. And then for momentarily, that pain you're experiencing will be relieved. Oh, great, now I can go faster. I've got more, another lane here. Well, what happens is you get triple convergence onto that route. So within the city you live in, people who weren't taking that route now will see that as a viable route. So you live there and maybe you didn't take that route before, but now you do. So that's convergence number one for new users to that roadway. Secondarily, you have people that don't live in your city or community that now says, oh, there's actually a new road over there. And we're going to use that road now because it's new and people are moving faster over there. So they converge on that road too. So now you've got two new users to the roadway. And then you have a third phenomenon, which is people who didn't live in your community now recognize that there's more service in your community and they move there and they use the road too. And this is what Mike was talking about a minute ago with the idea that when you build more rooftops, the service follows. Well, when you build more roads, the rooftops follow too. All these things are very linked, and your land use systems are linked to your transportation systems. So in that way, I would just say if you like your community, particularly in the village, if you think that you want to preserve the character of the buildings and of the neighborhoods, I would also consider your road system to be a part of that character. And in expanding the road system, you will be also kind of doing something that's in violation of that character that you're striving to preserve. There was a concept that we discussed in the meeting this afternoon called stroads, which is a street road, right? And I like this because it's a very understandable way of describing this concept. What happens when you expand a road or a street? You know, street is a place you go. Zionsville, the village of Zionsville is a place you go to, or you live there. You don't go through Zionsville, right? And Zionsville is not somewhere you go from one place to another. Oh, I'm just going to go through. I do. I mean, I'm like, oh, I'm going to go through Zionsville because it's so cool. It's worth the delay. I would rather spend more time going through a quality place, but I know what I'm going to. You know, roads are places you used to go through. Right. So there is another way of thinking about it as a street versus arterial. You know, arterials are meant for that regional traffic. And a stroad is kind of a place that it's not really either. And so it doesn't work. Right. You got to pick one. And I think that's another way of thinking about this is when you're traveling on the streets in that quality place, you don't want to turn that into a road. Right. You want to turn that into a place that doesn't have that character. And I think that's something that might not be as related to the zoning ordinance we're doing, but it's very related, I think, to the development perceptions in town. And I think it's worth noting that one of the things we've observed is the quality of the street network here. That makes it walkable, that makes it livable. And I actually think that extends to many of the rural roads as well. So more things. We have talked a lot about preserving rural character. We know this is true. Maintaining green and open space. I think another thing that we've heard is that we don't want to have cookie cutter developments. And what that means, I think, is developments that follow one similar pattern style or maybe two pattern styles. A hamlet system permitting cluster style zoning would preserve development rights with open space and permit pattern books that encourage buildings of styles that create the type of precedents that we have here in the village and create new hamlets or even new towns or mixed towns that represent that kind of architecture. We've heard a lot about the need to protect residents and farms and agriculture uses from encroaching commercial and industrial impacts. You know, this includes the push-pull between you know, heavy agriculture or more intense agriculture and residential units. And I think it's important to understand too, as we talk about agricultural preservation, we're talking about agriculture preservation. Agriculture is not residential, right? We don't call it the residential area, right? There is a district that we want, a rural residential district, which will be more about servicing those large lot residential districts. But in agricultural areas, agriculture is about, you know, farming or creating value from the land. And we need to understand that there are impacts of farming that really are, you know, not pleasant to residential areas. That's why the separation of use between agriculture and towns kind of initially was created for zoning, right? Those neighborhoods, they were not up against farms because the impacts of farming was, you know, it's not pleasant. We all know that animals can create odors, right? That there's noises and those things are part of the agricultural lifestyle. When we talk about preserving the agricultural lifestyle, we're talking about preserving those uses too. And I think that's an important thing to understand when you think about the mixes of uses in a district, is that just because something's an agricultural district doesn't mean that you can't doing other uses in it. You can still have a residential home in an agricultural district. You do. You can have large lot residential homes in an agricultural district. That is also something that is perfectly fine. But when you have those uses in agricultural districts, you have to protect the right of the farmers who are there too. And that's what makes it work. And I think that that's something that we have to commit to if we talk about this preservation of agriculture areas, is actually valuing the agricultural uses and permitting some of the other uses that exist there as well. I think that we've talked a lot about solar, and I think we want to talk about it tonight. So we've been listening. We've been listening to the talk about solar utility grade solar uses. I think that it's important to understand that why might a utility grade solar make sense in a farm area? Because we're talking about the pressure to build or valuing farmland only as residential. And if you value farmland only as residential, the inherent value change there is that we're going to develop farmland as residential. And I think that it's important to realize that realizing value from your farm is part of what farming is. You know, that being said, with the solar issue, I don't think we need to have solar in the agricultural district. We haven't solved that issue, but we've heard about it, right? And we're going to continue to hear about it. What I will tell you, and I've spoken to people on both sides of that issue, what I will tell you is that with reasonable standards, there could be something that achieved that would be a win-win. And I think most of the people I've talked to both sides see that. It could also be something that's not appropriate. It could be something that is appropriate. I'm not telling you tonight that I have a recommendation worked out on it, but what I have done is I've listened, I've heard about this issue, And I understand it, and I've worked in communities that have been battling on this issue too, because there are two sides. I believe strongly that we could craft standards that would help resolve this issue, but I think it's the community's decision about where this use is placed. And I think that's something that we'll continue to work with the community to solve. But I have been very pleased and happy to speak with everyone whose issue this is important to, and I think we'll continue to work on it. I think there's also a perception that rural areas don't pay for, or rural areas are paying for services that they're not receiving. I think that's a bit of a myth, right? There's truth in it, but I also think, as I mentioned in my intro, people who choose to live in the rural areas of this town do so knowing that the village is core to what makes this place work. And so I would say from a taxation perspective, the service boundary between rural and urban, that will stay in place. The taxation structure and what residents receive for being in different tax districts, this ordinance will not change that. What we're looking to do is think about only the land development parts of it. So you won't have, for instance, something called rural within the urban tax district anymore and something called urban within the rural tax district. We're going to look at the land for the types of regulations and uses that should go there, and we're going to simplify those districts. That's our proposal. And I just want to kind of say on this issue for rural areas paying for services they don't receive, or the free rider issue, that I think that's part of the choice that you make if you want to live in a community, is you do get to choose the services you receive, but we're all in it together. You know, I think that when we talk about these hamlets or new city areas, and then how we want the village to grow, how we want to protect the rural areas, the taxation policies, which we're not doing as part of this process, are designed to make everything work. And that's really something that people deal with in any jurisdiction that has multiple transect areas. So even in the rural areas, we heard more variety of housing type options is important. Being thoughtful of how land is zoned. So the idea of leapfrogging, right? Should a development be allowed to go from one area to another to another? It's really largely an issue of, you know, service provision and defining service boundaries for things like sewer, water, and aligning development with those. But you can certainly, through zoning, also control that. So you can require, for instance, a location of a new town to be contiguous to certain uses, to be contiguous to your road infrastructure. And when Mike was talking about how we were evaluating the best candidates for these mixed-use centers, it was really aligned with the existing infrastructure to prevent this leapfrogging. So let's find where those places of higher intensity might be appropriate. As Mike described them as satellites, village satellites. In doing that, I think we can prevent this leapfrogging activity where people are developing by where the opportunity is for them to develop. What we want to do is design the ordinance to pre-select those development locations. And then simple, easier, I think we've said that significant. And then the other thing I did want to mention about the conversation we've had on solar is utility grade solar is not just something that is limited to the agricultural district. It's definitely something that we could and should be considering in other areas, like industrial districts, even commercial districts on rooftops. You can design utility grade solar in those types of areas. And then we had an interesting idea about adding it to the airport district, which we will maintain. But that's a potential. I think I see potential in that idea as well. So other types of emerging uses are important as well, but I think solar is one of interest that we've heard a lot about this week. So moving on to what we've learned about the village. Again, a lot about the existing character, understanding the precedence of buildings and making sure that we match those. We talked about height limits. We've also expanded to think about floor plan for footprint limits. And then this 2 to 4 story thing, we've had an interesting discussion about that. And I think I'm going to propose or show you some illustrations of different building types. And one of the things that a form-based code allows us to do is actually have different height standards based on building type. So rather than saying, hey, we're going to allow 4 stories everywhere, or everything has to be 2 stories, we can actually define different height standards based on the type of building and a way that building becomes used. And I'm going to illustrate that in a second. We've also talked a lot about the enforcement of variances. Danielle highlighted that. The need for new housing types. Sometimes we call these missing middle housing types, but duplexes, triplexes, lease lofts, and accessory dwelling units or carriage houses with residential uses in them. Emerging uses like short-term rentals. We've talked a lot about parking standards and linking parking standards to supply and development. This is also a zoning adjacent theme. Zoning can be used to set the development standard, but the demand management is a policy issue. So we can recommend appropriate standards based on the types of uses that are going in, and we intend to do that. But we also, like I mentioned about transportation policy, we need to link those standards to good policies for parking. And a little bit of demand management, I think, would go a long way in the village. Sidewalks, this is definitely something that could be controlled by zoning. Adam, earlier today, you mentioned a regulation that was the first zoning or one of the zoning things for sidewalks.
Oh, I was simply going to say that the sidewalk conversation in the village has been going on since 1891, I believe. And that was when the first sidewalk construction ordinance was passed for a little section on Main Street on the west side, I believe. Don't quote me.
And then I think the other thing I want to mention is stormwater and drainage issues and water trespass, right? I think that there's kind of 2 ways of approaching this. One is through just, doubling down on saying you must process your water on your site, which is important. But there's, another way to look at the city systems for processing stormwater. But I think any regulations we can develop to encourage sustainable water processing, permeable surfaces, permeable and responsible construction techniques, and eliminating things that, like, for instance, maybe prevent native landscaping or things that are naturally help water infiltration. We can review for those things as well. Zoning is related, but I think also it's an engineering process and it's part of the engineering review. So we will look at these things, but I will say, process your water on the site and things will be a little easier. Also, we talked about lot coverage, issues with people tearing down and rebuilding and changing the character. We also talked about how lot coverage relates to the existing structures and all of the variances that have happened for accessory structures. Putting in new garages, expanding garages, or wanting to put in a carriage house. And also how patios and outdoor hardscape areas are included in those calculations. We had a comment today that the 35% lot coverage requirement is actually based on 8,000 square foot lots. Well, the actual plat was 5,000 square foot lots. So really a 35% coverage is a lot less on 5,000 square foot lot. And I think here, what we need to do is figure out the purpose of this regulation and then adjust it so that more things that are currently being granted variances become, by right permitted. I think we might also look at the real purpose for including patios and hardscape areas in that, if it is truly a sustainability based decision, we might want to look at tools that actually are designed to create that sustainability based outcome. And I think there's ways to do that, to create those incentives, but then also to permit the types of expansion to accessory structures that it seems like people in the community do desire. Again, fitting within the context of their surrounding. And this is why we adjust those types of dimensional standards. Mostly, today's family needs are not the same as they were historically. And we want things to accommodate modern life, but not be out of scale with the types of development that's existing here. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about ADUs and carriage houses. And there it is. All right. So I mentioned this idea of building types. I also talked earlier about the idea that in creating a form-based code, you can have pictures that help represent the types of developments. Well, a building type code will show some illustrations of the types of buildings that are permitted in districts, and then provide some guidance. So not strict architectural forms. We wouldn't say, for instance, every carriage house must be built exactly like this, but here are the characteristics of a good carriage house. And these are the things that are permitted in a carriage house. You may have a second residential unit. You may have a place for storage of facilities. But overall, it must be reflective of, maybe this much square footage based on the size of your primary house. And by having those standards in a building type code, you can create that variation in form, that form that will allow for some unique structures to be built, but to be built within the character of the surrounding village. And some things that fit into that character. So duplexes, this is an image of a stacked duplex. I mean, you can see how a home like this would very much fit with a single family home. This one's purple. We made it purple to match some of the colors that we witnessed around the city. A little bit of fun here, but we definitely like that character that we've seen in this community. Side by side. So there are ways of making duplexes appear more like duplexes rather than having a stacked form. You might actually have two doors on the front. The advantage of this is it allows for both residents to have a two-story structure and access to the street. And then there's things like the fourplex. So you're getting at a way in the fourplex of creating more housing to support the needs of more families, a more affordable housing, but also to do it in a way that doesn't create overbuilt structures, massive structures for apartments or loft style condos. So in a fourplex, you get 4 condos in one building, and these can be integrated into communities. And we do observe many communities that have over the years developed this. And I think, Adam, you had a clue today of why you don't see some of this stuff in Zionsville. Do I remember that correctly?
In terms of duplexes, fourplexes?
Yeah, as it developed, maybe there was an error that skipped.
As a developed type, and that's just unique, unique place in sort of regional history, right? In terms of Zionsville's growth trajectory. I think if maybe Zionsville hadn't been so close to Indianapolis, if its growth trajectory had been a little bit different and peaked maybe more around the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, I think you would have ended up seeing a lot more of these exact types of buildings in the village. So it's for historical reasons that you didn't. And again, these are representative images that we're showing. Paul, I want to drive the point home that, we think about now getting into the mechanics of coding and the mechanics of developed building types. As a matter of fact, these images are derived from a code that we did way up in the UP, Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Sault Ste. Marie. So the idea is that these illustrations get calibrated to match the community context. So a fourplex that maybe should have come to Zionsville 100 years ago, but didn't, but might get developed in the future to be, character and context appropriate, might not look like this image. So just treat it as a representative image for this evening.
Yeah, and I will also say, when we do visit communities and we find fourplexes, it's like discovering a little gem. We'll take a picture and be like, we found a fourplex, and share it around, because these are really cool types of buildings. And you don't see them very much, but you always see them in the village context. You don't see these much anywhere else. So another thing I like to show, right? Everyone talks about the importance of 2 stories or 3 stories. If you look around the village, you'll find many instances of 1-story buildings that are definitely appropriate and contribute to the context. So we want to code that so that those buildings are an option as well. But this is really the gem, right? The 2-story mixed-use building. This is what creates that character that Mike showed in Crested Butte. It's something that when you code it, it looks right. It looks like a historic village. And I think when people talk about wanting 2 stories, they don't really want 2 stories. They want this building, right? And this building, there's more to it than it being 2 stories. It's the lot size, it's the transparency of the shop fronts, it's carrying those shop fronts around the side if it's on a corner, it's consistency in the second floor window design, it's the way that the entrances, the recessed entryways are designed along the road frontage. There's a lot actually that makes this work and makes this successful that's actually not tied to the building height. And the advantage of coding this not as a height or a box and calling it a mixed use building is that then the X factor that makes this a desirable building type actually is better represented to the people who want to develop or even rehabilitate site in this manner. But there are some other building types that I think are really interesting. Mike is a big fan of the bank. Every community needs a bank, and having guidance on how to create a bank and what makes it different from the other types of building type is a part of what encourages that diversity of character in a new town. Similar, you might want a theater. And you can code things that specifically give a theater its unique character, and additionally civic institutions. So I actually think that the civic institution is a requirement to create a place of substance. I think that having guidelines for this type of use and even the bank or the theater, it's more important for those new mixed use areas, those satellite areas, so that we make sure as those are built, they're built as whole places with the types of services and needs that make places like the village actually work. And then we talked a little bit about this idea of 2-story max, or what a 2 or a 3-story max might be. And I think it's important to note why there is an economic incentive to build at a higher intensity, but also how it could be done in a way through building types that actually makes it speak to the vernacular, the architectural vernacular of the community. And the lease loft, I think, is a building type that I think really would help define what those loft spaces, whether they're a condominium space for sale or a leasable loft, how they would look. And particularly, there's this idea of the half story. And I want to point out here, if you look at this image and look at the first story, you actually see that the first story is really half story. So it's below grade. And these are garden apartments. So the value of garden apartments is twofold. One, they're typically a lot more affordable because they're submerged or they're below grade. They do allow light because they have windows. But the interesting thing about these windows is that by their placement and a half story is they actually raise the first full above ground story higher. And what that means is for the people walking along the street, they don't look directly into the windows of the people in the garden apartments, and they're not tall enough to look into the windows of the people on the first floor. So it creates a little civility and walkability in the way that these residential units are actually integrated into the road network. So that half story, I think, is really important. And the other thing that I wanted to note is we did talk about step back or grading. So you could imagine with this structure at 3 stories, or 3.5 stories. If we were then to also take the top story and instead of make it a full story, but to step it back so that it can't be viewed from the street. You could create things like maybe rooftop dining. Maybe you could create a penthouse apartment or penthouse unit that would have a roof garden or some roof access, which would be very nice. So you could actually, instead of, and I highlighted the top, I think we're really talking in Zionsville about 3.5 stories, possibly 3.5 stories with an invisible setback. So we would chop the top off that one, but it is a good illustration for the type of thing we're talking about with the lease loft building type. I think the other thing we want to point out is that a lot of the massive loft style apartments that are built as mixed use, built with kind of fake facades that show variations. Adam was calling those Mr. Potato Head buildings, because maybe they've got an ear stuck here and a little hat on them, and they don't really speak as one cohesive thing. This building speaks as one cohesive thing. And so when you define your higher buildings by building type, what you do is you say, if you want to build at a higher height, you must build something of this character, something of this value. And only if you build this type of building would you be permitted to go above 2 stories. And I think that's a real good way of solving this, this concept of character, right? What we really want, for the most part, is this building, right? This is the building we want for the most part. We also recognize that economics and the need for housing really makes people want to maximize those residential uses. Well, then we should be talking about a different type of building. We should be talking about a small residential apartment building. And these are also buildings that are kind of absent from the current landscape. We will take questions at the end. Thank you. I've got a couple other buildings here. I don't know exactly if these fit, but I want to put them in because they're interesting. A hotel. There's very specific ways to think about this style of structure, different from an inn. I think we've been staying at a wonderful inn in the village, but some standards for hotels would be interesting. Again, we would not make this as tall as this, but in general, a hotel is kind of a grand feature. You should be able to recognize it by its character. This is another example. This is really a, you would most often see this kind of a building. This is an office loft. You'd most likely see this as a renovation of an existing industrial building type, which is not, you do not see these in Zionsville, but if you were to imagine the construction of a new mixed use center, you might actually want to include some larger office technical research type buildings, and you can integrate those types of buildings within a town environment in a way that's natural and actually makes these contributing structures to the quality of the aesthetic. So those are my building types. I've got a few more slides here. We have been working on the consolidation of districts. We've come up with 16 proposed districts, reduced from about 40. So that's a big reduction. And this table here shows how each of those districts within the current code would relate to a new district. And really what we found is there is not a lot of substantive difference between these districts that we're going to recommend consolidating. So what we're going to be doing is a little bit of a conformity analysis. As we go through the standards in each of these districts, we're going to be evaluating where there's differences and making sure that the standard that would best serve all of the districts will be the one that prevails. When I say best serves, I really mean the standard that will create the least amount of non-conformity. What we want to do is increase conformity with what is existing built, right? So that this new code will bring those into conformity and then also require that anything new will also match the existing character. This is something you can do in places that have characters that people like, right? If there was a lot that we were seeing that was out of place, we would be looking to make those non-conforming by the code, right? And there's a little bit of that that we'll be looking for too, but in general, I think we can actually take these districts and consolidate them effectively. We've also started to look through how uses that are defined with respect to specific uses. we want to consolidate those as well. So we don't want 12 or 20 different things that are retail types of uses. We want to say, hey, we've got retail. Are you under 20,000 or are you over 20,000? If you're over 20,000 square feet, and actually 20,000 might not be the right trigger here, but from a perspective, hopefully you understand what I mean. What we can do is control retail by size rather than by type of use. And then additionally, we want to consolidate those uses. And then based on those, what's permitted in those existing districts, we've begun to evaluate whether things might be a permitted use, a special land use, or a use that's only permitted as accessory to another use in that district. And this is kind of a first shot of part of that use permit table that I put in the presentation tonight. But what I wanted to illustrate is that that process of consolidation, it's both about the districts and about what's permitted in the districts. And then we have worked through an initial regulating plan. And this is actually interesting because when you take this approach, what we're able to do is actually take the existing zoning map and this code that I showed you, and using geographic information systems, we can immediately code a new map. Now, this is a draft map for our evaluation, but it's basically what we're saying is if we take all of these districts and then we re-represent them in this new consolidated structure, what would the zoning map look like? And this illustration here shows a GIS analysis of what happens. And it's definitely exciting to work through this process where we can actually come to a point where we can say, hey, this is a draft map for us to say, how does this work? As we go through the process of editing the standards, looking at the uses that are permitted, and then looking at the properties on the ground. Does this make sense? Where do we need to adjust to make sure that the morphology and transition of uses from the central high place in the village core to the preservation areas in the townships, how should that be represented? And is it represented properly in the code now as we look to this consolidated district structure? This is just a zoom up. I zoomed in so you could see a little better the variation, and the blue colors and purple colors towards the village are representative of the more form-based district, form-based character. And then as you go out, the green colors are representative of the rural, and the lighter green of rural residential, large lot, rural residential zoning descriptions with yellow being more primarily a residential or a neighborhood classification. So additionally, I wanted to show you this evening, as Mike talked about, we've been adjusting where we thought these town centers could go and working on how they might lay out and integrate. On the first night, we learned about Fayette, which we thought maybe there was a site closer into the hamlet that would service. But then we learned about Ronald Reagan Parkway. And a suggestion from one of the residents who attended that meeting was to evaluate actually moving this new center idea to the Parkway. You know what? That was a great idea. So immediately we shifted, and Mike actually worked a little bit on how that might lay out. And this is, very conceptual. But what I really like about it is it illustrates how in order to have a successful retail or mixed use area, you really do need to align it with the system. And this is a system that would be perpendicular off Ronald Reagan. So those red buildings in the middle are your primary town center. So right off Ronald Reagan Parkway, you would have a walk that then enters onto a green. In the middle of the green, there's something that illustrates a civic space or community space. Actually, we were able to do some talking in a gazebo over here when it was raining. And it's an illustration of why having a space like that in a community is essential for its function. And then what I really like about this plan that Mike came up with is he was actually able to do some interesting things with the road network to then actually link this new center into the historic Fayette Center with these diagonal roads. And it's a concept, but I think it's a proof of concept. And I'm excited to show that to you. Similarly, there's, I think, a less I think a more natural fitting site. We didn't have a lot of discussion about this site because I think it makes so much sense. It's on Whitestown Parkway, and it's actually kind of an island. It's an island of the town that is really surrounded by Whitestown. And we did a little illustration for how that could be developed as a town center as well. You know, the benefits of which certainly would be, you know, receiving of new tax dollars to Zionsville on a site that's largely underutilized right now. And then we started to look at Roston. I know Mike mentioned we initially thought that this might be better placed south of here, but we were encouraged to look at the historic hamlet of Roston, and we did go up and look at it, and we agreed. This actually shows coming into the historic hamlet of Roston and then going north. We actually think we think south might be an option too. So if we were to go into Roston and then extend this hamlet to the south, maybe in addition to going to the north or instead of going to the north. But as this concept develops, I do think that this idea of a town center in Roston is one that is intriguing. And again, these areas would serve as satellites to the village. So as you think about some of the pressure in the village to function for higher population area, some of that, these satellites can work with the village to create and reinforce that context in the community. And that's why precedents matter too, because we would anticipate that the development would also be controlled by the same building types we were developing for the village. So the village development building types would also be the building types that would be replicated in these satellite areas. And that's one of the benefits of a form-based code. So I did a little bit to try to synthesize a lot of the things we discussed. I also, wanted to make sure that some of the things we've discussed, I made sure to talk about tonight, so that everyone could see that we've been listening and we've been really working on understanding what matters to residents in Zionsville. We want to understand why so many of you have been partners with us in this process, why you've come out every day and helped us to understand the issues, and why you care about the outcome of this process. We care too. And we greatly appreciate learning from you and working with you. And as Adam said, we're going to be working on this for a little bit. So we will continue to update the town code website, the ZionsvilleTownCode.com website. And we are here tonight, and we would like to continue our discussion tonight with you all. But hopefully this has been a good wrap up or a good synthesis of some of the things that we've discussed. Adam, do you have closing remarks?
My closing remark is to say thank you. This was a bit of a marathon presentation, and I do appreciate you sticking around. Maybe take a 5-minute break, and we're more than happy to engage with you. We still have our kitchen table map that we've been carrying around all week. Please take a look at that. And feel free to add your own sticky notes. That's by no means closed for comment. That is there, as well as the big idea board over in the corner of the room as well. And like I said, we'll certainly be sticking around, and would love to speak to you tonight. Know that, again, this isn't goodbye. This is really more of the beginning of this process than the end. So again, many, many thanks on behalf of our entire team.
All right, thank you, everybody. And come see me at let's talk questions over at the map. So if you had questions, let's go over there and talk.